DC Studios isn't a real studio. Now that's going to upset some of you. You're going to say I'm anti-DC, I'm anti-James Gunn. No, I believe you, my subscribers, my viewers, whether you're watching on Instagram or YouTube, whatever. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter, ex-Twitter at MoviesTVMad, and on Instagram at MoviesTVMadX. But I want to be direct and honest with you. I think you need to understand what's going on here. And DC Studios certainly isn't a real studio. And I can prove this in about 30 seconds, right? I'm going to compare DC Studios with Marvel Studios. So once upon a time, when the people who formed Marvel Studios, probably Kevin Feige, Luis Desperito, and all those type of, Marvel people, proper Marvel people who have been part of Marvel for such a long time, when they formed that studio, it had nothing to do with Disney. It was an independent studio, like A24 is right now, had nothing to do with any of the bigger studios. And Disney saw that it was a great idea. I mean, imagine that. A comic book company forming a movie studio, a little independent studio, and look at what it is today. So it was an independent studio. It wasn't a studio in name only like DC Studios. Then they were bought by Disney. But even then, there's still more of an independent studio today being owned by Disney than DC Studios is. DC Studios is just a logo. It isn't a real studio. Why is it important that you, DC fans and moviegoers, know that? So you understand what's going on. So you can make informed choices. So when James Gunn's talking on social media, you understand who's talking to you. Now, he's a capable writer-director. As I've said many, many times, I like his CBMs. It's sad that I have to keep on kind of quantifying and qualifying my thoughts and opinions. But when I say DC Studios isn't a real studio, I am speaking facts. This is true. It is not a real independent studio in any way, shape, or form. So, for example, the DC Studios logo is now on the Penguin, for example. DC Studios is literally just the logo of what James Gunn's doing with his DC franchise. That's it. It's not a real studio. And really, the DC Studios logo probably should only be on the James Gunn stuff like Superman, Waller, Creature Commandos. I can accept that more than them plastering the DC Studios logo on the Penguin. The Penguin had nothing to do with James Gunn and Peter Safran. I think it's utterly disrespectful that James Gunn's tried to attach himself to that series. Disrespectful to Matt Reeves and to the showrunner, Lauren LaFranc. He had nothing to do with it. He tried to give them notes. James Gunn should not be giving people like Todd Phillips and Matt Reeves notes. It's ridiculous. Ridiculous. Matt Reeves and Todd Phillips are great independent writer-directors in their own right. They don't need James Gunn. They don't need James Gunn telling them what to do. But all of a sudden, this guy is their boss. And I can prove to you even further that DC Studios isn't a real studio. The co-CEO of that so-called studio and that company, what's his name? Peter Safran, nearly forgot it. I remembered it, then forgot it. I'm getting old and I like to drink a bit. So the grey cells and, the brain cells are kind of going, which little there already were. But Peter Safran and his little production company, which came into the DCEU once Snyder was driven out and Hamada came in. And I think he was kind of connected with Hamada, and I think he worked with him over at New Line Cinema, which is a little subsidiary that WB also own. So Safran was already involved with the DCEU from Aquaman, Shazam, and a few others, Aquaman 2 and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, and a lot of movies that didn't make a lot of money, by the way. Now, people seem to have forgotten all about that. They've got a co-CEO who came from a failed part of DC film. It's interesting, isn't it? Look, it's all very interesting. Creatively, these films are the brainchild, supposedly, of James Gunn. So, if you agree with me that DC Studios is not an independent studio like Marvel Studios, right? Then we have to ask the question, how much freedom, creative freedom, do they have? Was it James Gunn's idea, for example, to make Superman the first movie of DCU? Absolutely not. He wouldn't have wanted that. He's not really, I've told you a billion times, James Gunn isn't a Superman guy, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of Superman movie we get. This trailer we hopefully see in December should tell us a lot. But DC Studios is not an independent studio. It's just a trademark. So why does DC Studios actually exist? Why did Zaslav decide that there has to be a DC Studios? He wanted you to think that, it was like Marvel, all of a sudden there's a supremo like James Gunn in charge, someone like Kevin Feige, because fans were always saying, why can't we be like Marvel? They've got a Marvel Studios, why can't we have a DC Studios as well? But it's just a name. It's just a logo. It isn't a studio at all. It's just Warner Brothers. It's just Warner Brothers Discovery. And it's just a trademark. It's just a logo. And that's it. And I don't think that Gunn has the freedom he claims he has. He's got a bit of creative freedom. I tell you what, you'll see that freedom disappearing, vanishing very quickly if Superman doesn't make the money Warner Brothers Discovery and Zaslav need. And they need all the money they can get, because Superman's box office is going to be very, very important for the future of DCU. Now, it's interesting when you listen to movie pundits, whether it's YouTube ones like Nerdrodic or Campia. Campia's put some doubts over certain things in terms of Superman. Campia's a big Man of Steel fan, but not so much BVS, which is interesting. For example, Grace Randolph hated Man of Steel, but loved BVS, being a big Batman fan. It's interesting. But, people like Nerdrodic put a lot of stock behind James Gunn. He thinks Superman will do better than Fantastic Four. But Nerdrodic hates Disney. Everyone's got a bias. Now, I don't have a bias, but I'm not happy that Henry Cavill isn't Superman. I'm not happy that an auteur like Snyder was driven out. I think he created great DC movies. He gave us a kind of an opposite, a yin for Kevin Feige's yang. And some people rejected that, but it's going to be interesting because once you see Superman, James Gunn's Superman, whether you want to do it or not, you will be comparing it to Man of Steel. You will not be comparing it to Superman 78. When Superman Returns came out, when Man of Steel came out, there was an absolute comparison to Superman 78, because Superman 78 is Mount Everest, isn't it? And it's been really hard for people making Superman films, recently, or shows or whatever, to compare to that movie, because it is kind of the ultimate Superman movie. And Man of Steel was compared to that movie. But Man of Steel was a contemporary, modern-day Superman movie. It was a very brave movie in a lot of ways. It wasn't about people-pleasing, it was about doing what the director, Nolan and Goya, wanted to do. And it's interesting, and I think it's aged beautifully, and I think a lot of you, if not all of you, agree with that at the very least. Whether you like the direction or you like the kind of tone, it has aged beautifully. Man of Steel is a great contemporary Superman movie. So, as far as I'm concerned, James Gunn's Superman and DCU has a huge act to follow. And we don't really know much about this Superman movie. But I do know one thing, that DC Studios isn't a real studio. It's a studio in name only. It's not Marvel Studios. Marvel Studios was a proper studio in its original formation. Then it was bought up by Disney. It's still an independent studio with its own employees. DC Studios doesn't have its own employees. It seems to have its little writing team, and that's that. But I don't believe it's a real studio. I think it's a studio in name only.